we are going to open this meeting as CPAC, and then here in a few minutes we'll suspend our normal business and hand it over to the mayor, ETDD. So let's stand and have a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Situation of my hair. All right, so we are on the, I would say, round and third base on our efforts with the community plan, Commissioner. And so with a discussion recently with the mayor, we would like to suspend our normal business and turn it over to the mayor, and I'll let you kind of tee this up.
Yeah, so very exciting. Tonight we're going to be having a workshop that will be facilitated by our colleagues at East Tennessee Development District to talk about what's in the zoning ordinance so that that can inform our community plan. Now remember that the Land Use and Transportation Plan, what we call the community plan, is the overarching document that provides guidance and vision to the Planning Commission and to the City Council. And so it is a really important document. It is necessarily at a fairly high level, and it is envisioned to lay out a vision for the city for the next 10 years or so. So our last Land Use and Transportation Plan was aimed at 2010 to 2020. So we eclipsed 2020 now. And this Land Use Transportation Plan, or what we call our community plan, will hopefully set the goals for the next 10 years. And so we've been working busily to look at the chapters of that Land Use Transportation Plan, but necessarily there are things in that plan that guide what goes in the zoning ordinance, what goes in the subdivision regulations. And so it's important to maybe take a look at something that's a little more granular. And that's what we're going to do during this workshop tonight, is we're going to take a look at the zoning ordinance in a little more detail so that we can be better informed on what goes in the Land Use and Transportation Plan. So the idea is not like we're going to do a line-by-line edit of the zoning ordinance. That is the purview of the Planning Commission. And so when the zoning ordinance is updated, the Planning Commission will initiate that work. But what will come in the Land Use and Transportation Plan will be general land use policies. I think it's in section 5 of the Land Use Transportation Plan, and then there will be some suggestions for implementation. And so if you're familiar with the document that's up online now, this is it, it's a paper copy. Section 5 and section 6 are the sections that really help to inform the work of the Planning Commission and of the City Council to a certain extent in terms of what needs to be updated and things. So we're going to have that workshop tonight. I'm real excited about it. It's quite a milestone to being able to get to that. So looks like we're still...
So we're going to work through some technical
okay.
issues here.
The documents.
So just open up the
So while we're waiting, let me just give you an example. So here's how it sort of works. We did a series of surveys of our community, so really focused on our residents, also our visitors, folks in the Tuckaleechee Cove area, and we asked them, what are the important things for Townsend? What do you like about Townsend? What's important to preserve and protect? What should we be mindful of when we're developing our community plan? One of the things that came up in there is dark sky. So we still have, relatively speaking, dark sky in Townsend, and so part of the reason that we have that dark sky is because we have lighting ordinance. So there's a section of the zoning ordinance that talks about lighting, and so the way all these pieces fit together is we have input on dark sky. Do you want dark sky, or do you want light sky and flashing lights and things like that? And if you want dark sky, which is what the survey told us, then there has to be something in here in the land use and transportation plan that says, as a community, we value this, and we need to take steps to look at our lighting. And if y'all have been through other communities, you'll see that in some communities they have a whole variety of lighting policies that are generally dictated by their zoning ordinance. It talks about downlit signs, that talks about shielding of lights, it talks about all kinds of things. And so as we're looking through the land use and transfer, the zoning ordinance tonight, we'll be looking at some of those things that maybe have come out and maybe have not been heretofore addressed. Are we ready? I'll provide you with another good example while we're waiting. The zoning types. So we've had quite a lot of discussion in Townsend about B1, B2, B3. Not so much about R1, R2, but we have talked a little bit about that. Some folks might know we've even got M1. So we have a variety of zoning types that are in the zoning ordinance. But where do you get the big guidance for that type of stuff? Well, it comes from the land use and transportation plan. But you sort of have to know how are you going to organize your city. So planning has been going on for a long time throughout history. Romans had plans for city plans. How do you organize? You don't necessarily want to put the latrine right next to your homestead or something like that. So it is important to get the right things in the right places. And that's how zoning helps us. So we try to make sure that where people are living has compatible types of uses and things. And then where we have businesses, they have some additional parameters for that. But we'll be talking about those two things, lighting and zoning, I'm sure, tonight.
I'm going to run through the data information because it's just...
Ken, if as much as possible, if you use the microphone, this is being recorded. Thank you. All around with you if you have to.
All right, so I'm going to go through the data first of all. This is something we worked through with the UT Data Center. Basically, it's just given a profile of different data points about Townsend. This essentially shows the population growth, where there was a dip and sometime shortly around 2017. This shows the population pyramid, where you can see that age groups for Townsend are just about the same as for Maggie, North Carolina. And then there's also the 80 to 15 year group. And if you take 55 and 65 plus, you can see that it's closing in about 50% of the population here is a graded population to some extent. Okay, this also shows the estimated number of children, and basically this population set is quite small, but it shows that from the years from under 5 to 9 to 15 to 17, and if you would probably imagine the people in the 15 to 17 year group probably age out of the community, probably move on, and I don't know what that is going to have effect on the school system, but basically this is basic. I would assume that the school population will decrease or be suppressed at a level that might not even sustain the school. So that's one thing that 15 to...
Just note, we only have an elementary school here, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
15 to 17 doesn't matter, but the under 5 is
Under
actually
5,
very
yes.
important, and it's actually the largest contingent, so it's
Exactly.
the opposite of what we just said there.
Yes, sorry. And this shows the number of people who have resided here in the same house over a year. And as you can see, the vast majority has been around at least for a minimum of a year in the community. And a few have moved in from within the same county.
Can't
But you
hear
don't
you.
have all.
You can't hear me. It's just not close enough to your mouth.
Is this better?
Oh, yes, much.
All right, sorry about that. All right. I keep that in mind, all right. So of course, this is just clear what the racial demographics are for the town. And this shows the educational attainment. There's quite a high population of educated people in the community. As you can see, there's also a large set of high school graduates. And the question is, who are these people? Where are they being employed? And are there any opportunities for them in towns? And then also you have those who are not graduated from high school as well. And the question is, what sort of educational opportunities, job opportunities, economic opportunities they would have in towns? That's one thing that. And this is a comparison between Townsend and the other communities in the area. As we had mentioned earlier, we were going to use other mountainside adjacent or Smoky Mountain adjacent communities. That's why we chose Maggie Valley. And then you also see it for Blount County and for Alcoa as well. And this indicates travel for work. Most people, as you can see, travel 10 to 24 miles, which we may assume that they are basically working in the metropolitan area. And that would probably include anywhere from Maryville, Alcoa, and maybe some outskirts of Moscow as well. And this shows the industries that are active in the community. As you can see, the large majority of them are for accommodation and food services. There are other, and then also have real estate and rental and leasing, which is also quite high. I'm assuming that would then cover all the seasonal homes and the Airbnbs and all those other structures that are being used for short-term rentals. And then you can see there's also for retail trade. And as you can see there, there's been a dip in the number of real estate and rental and leasing. But I think that that is something that is probably going to grow rather than see that steep decline in due course. But if it's going to be decreasing, then I think the city should look at ways to make sure that it doesn't increase to the point where you are having not only a residential community, but a residential community that is prone to investment properties and so let's say investors, so that you don't have a lot of empty homes. So I think that one thing we're going to mention with other PowerPoints is we're going to talk about short-term rentals and how other communities are doing that. For example, Pittman Center.
Kim, before you move on, let me ask this question. The slide before, it just doesn't, to me, it doesn't reference the fact, so you got less than 10 miles. Is that a particular number or percentage, or, so these are the people, like, what comes to my mind is a lot of these people, you know, Hedricks and a lot of folks that live here and work here, or where they're part of the artisan community or whatever. Is that can we capture that as a percentage of the population, or?
Well, one of the things that we routinely got issues with the UTK is that the town is way too small to be captured in and of itself within its boundaries. So a lot of the data also has to basically more so consider the zip code.
So that's the zip code?
Exactly, exactly. So It doesn't necessarily mean that these are people just in Townsend and within the boundaries of Townsend, but it could be within the larger zip code area.
Thank you, sorry.
And in this slide here, I'm a little curious about when it says that real estate and rental leasing, that's not a job, right? Is that just rentals or?
Those are jobs. All this up here are jobs in Townsend. And as you can tell, or as one can reason, a lot of these rental and leasing properties do not require large staff, especially if it's not a hotel or a motel. So I would also suggest that if it is declining, we should make sure that it doesn't, we don't get complacent that there's no issues with short-term rentals in the community.
Is it possible it went up because of COVID and now it's come back down to normal?
Well, I would assume that if it was COVID, it will not
Why
decline.
can't we see what year that is, that the teal color is high? What year is that?
2020.
Yeah, that peak is actually like at 2020, so,
Which was
but it would have been predated COVID because it wouldn't take data from that, like that to high. It would be like, that's what 2019 was, we're reporting on it, and then we're now looking at data, and the next point that would be reflecting on the last couple of years. I don't know, I mean, that's definitely a weird number for me, it doesn't really make sense, but Kim, are you saying with your comments that like, it moving to zero is actually a bad thing because it means that they're like all of these properties are being managed by people outside of town?
No,
Or is that,
I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying that don't assume that the decline means that there is not an issue, for example, with short-term rentals. Because I would say that a lot of the rental and leasing market is as much now being catered to by short-term rentals as opposed to traditional hotels and motels. So I'm saying that the fact that it is showing that there's a decline in the real estate and rental and leasing market doesn't mean that there's not an issue to be considered in the zoning ordinance, for example, when it comes to rental and leasing of properties, especially those that are for residential structures, let's put it that way.
yeah, and so I guess what you're saying though is that we don't need to forget this, but the data does not support that. I mean, so not to like, I think we all know that there are plenty of short-term rentals around here and stuff, I got that, but my point is that this data is basically showing us that no one in Townsend, according to the data, works in short-term rentals. No one in Townsend has their employment listed as like, I'm a investor that has 5 or 6 Airbnbs that's my primary income.
Yes, but what I'm also saying is that that type of rental, that type of establishment does not require a sizable amount of staff. It's basically an owner with a property that probably has a temporary person coming to clean after each visit, but they don't maintain a regular staff whereby you will see increases in employment being strongly correlated with rental and leasing.
So if the market really hasn't fluctuated that much for jobs, it went from its peak to its lowest point from point to point.
Yes.
So I tend to, agree with Houston's statement here is, I would take that last line out. It seems kind of premature or irrelevant. It can't be 0 people working. A lot of these folks here work multiple jobs, maybe working at gas stations or food service or cleaning cabins. That's a very common occupation around here, cleaning rooms or whatever. So I can't see it at 0. It's just got to be the data's high.
Well, yes, these are all clearly aggregates to a large extent. So, and as I said, the community is also small. We could borrow from here assumption that during COVID, people were not coming to rent establishment, rental and leasing places. But that doesn't mean that I would actually argue that with the Airbnbs and the variables, it probably saw more of an increase than a decrease. But that type of establishment does not hire staff to to the intensities of
Yeah,
a regular.
we can't format a plan based on maybes and approximations. It has to be factual data.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the offset of other, I mean, other can be cleaning companies. And those cleaning companies can be contractors that then work with all these things. And so I think it's dangerous, a dangerous road to go down to start using our best guesses for something when the data's not supporting it. Now, of course, we all have lived experiences and we all have things that we see in the community, but still, just, this is a weird thing to get hung up on right now.
Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. I agree.
Because we have a lot more slides to go
Oh, yeah.
with the zoning ordinance. So this also shows the where people work in Townsend and outside of the county. The vast majority work in the county. That would also mean that they don't also have to commute that far. And this shows the income. Clearly indicates that Townsend is a high income area. Not quite, the vast majority earn quite a bit of money. And so that's just simply a portrait of the sort of people that live in the community.
Is that the zip code or the Townsend proper?
That's the zip code. That's what he said earlier.
None of the data here is specific to Townsend in and of itself, because Townsend is way too small to capture reliable data on the size of its community. There are only a few hundred people here, and that's not a large enough subset to get aggregate data about, unless you do an actual. So then this also shows the income comparison between other communities, and more so than the others. Townsend also has a disproportionate relative to the other communities, including Alcoa and Blount County in general, in terms of income levels for the town.
So are those household incomes or individual incomes?
These are aggregate incomes of the people who live in the community.
Okay.
So it's not
necessarily household incomes.
No. When I spoke to UT, this has nothing to do with households in general. It has to do with the aggregate of income that people earn in the community or in the zip code. Or this gives you a good idea of what income levels are in Townsend and the general area. Okay. None of this information is specific to Townsend. Okay, it's to the general area. And the active listings market is pretty good for Townsend, between 5 and 6.
Can't hear you.
This shows that the active housing listings, basically how long and when these houses come on the market. It shows that there's always, the active listings come up in October of 2023. And then they dipped during 2024 in January and then went up again. The listings basically, when I spoke to the East Tennessee Realtors, is that the score for that in Townsend is 5 to 6, which shows that it's got a healthy market whereby houses come on the market and within 30 days, most of them are sold. So that basically just shows the housing listings as we got from the East Tennessee Realtors, in terms of the trends of house listings. And this one also shows housing prices. These are median incomes. One of the things that was skewing some of the average data was that there are few high-priced homes that skew the price of homes in the area. So as you can see, right now they hover above 400, and they will be climbing up, as I mentioned sometime in the past with the committee, that at some point the housing prices for the community are going much higher, well past 600 and approaching something towards the amounts of 800,000. But the average homes the median average homes, the median homes prices in Townsend stand at about $399, let's say $400,000 for now. But there are a few properties that are skewing some of the average prices for Townsend in and of itself. Okay, and this one shows the housing listings for Maggie Valley as against Townsend. And again, like UTK suggested, these are aggregate numbers, and they basically just show the trends where there were heights of housing listings in 2018. They went way down around 2022, and they're coming back up steady. And this is showing it for Alcoa and Townsend, so just to show different housing listings in different housing markets that are rather adjacent to Alcoa. And similarly, this was done with Maggie Valley, North Carolina. And again, these are the housing prices over here. Right before, as you can see in Townsend, the prices went way up, and that is explained by a few homes out there skewed way up higher than the average prices for homes in the area. And this are the permits that were issued over the last several years, from 2014 to 2024. And as you can see, there's a steep uplift in the permits right after COVID, and they're probably expected to grow higher and higher and higher. This doesn't segregate between what is residential and what is commercial or non-residential. This was gotten from Doug Blair, our building inspector, the permits that he keeps track of over the past number of years. And this shows owner versus rental occupied, but I hope that at some point we get a better appreciation of how much of the owner occupied are actually fully family occupied as against them being used for short-term rentals. And these are indication of the vacant housing units in Townsend, Alcoa, Blount County, and Maggie, North Carolina. And again, I think this is something that we need to be clear about, what constitutes as vacant. And as you can see, the vast majority of them are seasonal, recreational, and occasional use. The amount of people who are actually fully occupying the homes is very, very low, especially when you consider the seasonal, recreational, and occasional use. And these are the sources of the information that we worked with the UTK Data Center. Some more sources. And again, the limitations of, there's some more sources again, sorry. Which I've mentioned already. And the limitations are, this data is from realty.com. It is economic research at the zip code level, and therefore may not include properties outside of towns. Analysis is purely descriptive. So this is not solid, quantifiable data specific to towns. For the next slides, could I bring it over to you and then you, because it's really disjointed having to do this. So the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Do you want to have any discussion while we're
Yeah, I'm happy to share some observations on that. So I think, what these data tell us is that, our population is older relative to some other communities. And that, our housing stock is quite expensive, which we've heard as well. We do have a number of children under 5. I was really impressed with that number. I think having an elementary school, here helps, but eventually, kids do get older and they go to middle school or something else. But that's a very encouraging sign, I would say, to have that many young children. So I think, it's nice to have some of these data. I'm not worried about the fact that it's at the zip code level. I think a lot of it has entrances, to the city of Townsend. So, I think it's good, valuable information for us to have and to consider. The other thing, the amount of the housing stock that is occupied seasonally. I think that's very true as well. So when I went out a couple of years ago knocking on doors, there were a number of doors I didn't get an answer, and I sort of figured it might be somebody's part-time home. I do think that we need to consider in our land use policies how to encourage more full-time residents in Townsend. And so if we lose a balance of full-time residents, it will have some serious implications, I think. So if most of your town doesn't live here all the time or at all, then that has some very serious implications for how you operate your city. So I think anything we can do to, as far as our land use policies, to encourage full-time occupancy, I think that will help us a lot. I'm not so worried that people might decide to have a vacation home here in Townsend. I think that's always been the case, probably always will be the case, but we need to pay careful attention to maintaining full-time residents, because once you lose that, if you look at some of these other communities, you lose that balance. It's very, very difficult to get it back.
Not that we have a control over it, but we saw the younger population, under 5 or whatever, was rising, but we also saw home values rising. There's going to be a point where younger couples that have 5-year-olds that's going to be out of a lot of people's price range. So that's something to consider when we're looking at residential opportunities at a lower level also. Just my observation. Kim, are you ready to?
Yeah, I would prefer to sit down because this is very comfortable.
But there's a microphone over there.
Yes, I'll sit over here and continue.
Okay.
So basically, this
Microphone, please.
Microphone.
Sorry. It's okay.
All right, so this is basically information that I had discussed with you all quite a few times, which is basically the scrubbing of the document. So this ordinance is sent to the Planning Commission, City Commissioners, CPAC, and to the PZA members, for which we ask them to provide some comments, some feedback, some inquiries about the document. This document here, now, this presentation includes all those comments in a PowerPoint, and there's some discussion, some analysis to be had over all that feedback. So including with our staff, civic leaders provided input into this document. And the idea here, as the mayor has mentioned, is that is for it to guide any future discussion, actions, revisions, decision-making regarding the community and its zoning going forward. So these are the chapters in which most of the comments were the comments addressed. And if you could move to the next slide, then we can start going through the next one, please, as well. Okay, good. So here, as you can see, there is a dichotomy between a set of strict definitions and terms, which risk making them obsolete. Sometime in the past, we had these discussions about what constitutes a hotel these days, and what basically is hospitality as against just strictly a hotel or a motel. As we can say, for example, these days a taxi is not a taxi anymore. More so, a taxi has morphed into being an Uber. So the question is, what definitions should we provide for short-term lodgings, accommodations, such that things from hotels, bed and breakfast, chalets, cabins, motels, yurts, Airbnbs, verbal, campgrounds, glamping, hostels, campers, and motorhomes and hostels. These are all things that are prone to rigid definitions that would not basically be in keeping with the type of developments that may come to Townsend and for which decision making will be sought. So then we also want to discuss or think about limiting the number of short-term rentals. Right now, for example, in Pittman Center, they've come to a point where 2/3 of the residences are investment properties in Pittman Center. So they're not even owned by owners, they are owned by investors. Okay? So that is something that, as I was mentioning before with that slide about the fact that jobs are going down in the sector doesn't mean that the availability and the impacts of that in terms of other alternate forms of short-term rentals are not going to impact the community. So that is something I think that the community should keep a keen eye on in that regard. And some of the things you could also consider is maybe if you want to have a system that limits the number of these short-term rentals, and that, for example, like in New York City, one has to bid for and compete for medallions for cabs, so there's not a glut of them. You also want to consider that they not be too much of a glut, as Pittman Center has come to realize in their community. So, at the same time, I think there should be a caveat to the regulations to provide a recourse with the BZA for any disputes or exercises in definitional interpretation. One of the things I would recommend that the city get, and I've also asked our office to get, is the current version of the APA's Planners Dictionary, so that if you should rely or want to concentrate on the definition, then you get that dictionary and keep it handy. But I would say that more so, the community should rely more on the hospitality DNA of what it is, rather than on the strict definitions that are prone to be misinterpreted, fought over, and I would say misinterpreted for the purposes of a permit petition that would come before the city. All right, next slide, please. Oh, and before, to revert back to that for one moment, no, don't change it, is that we also should think of ways where you can figure out how to verify that a person's residence is their primary residence. So for example, in some other communities, they ask that you have a driver's license or some other means to show that, this is not a rental property or a seasonal property, more so than not an investment property that is going to challenge the character of your community. One of the ways in which the city is doing that right now is that they have come up with a single family dwelling use form as a way to determine that. But it still does not mean that you can unfairly arrest somebody's use of their property as they see fit. Now, another thing that you could consider in terms of housing is the idea that you have a shortage of affordable homes. I was already mentioned that a lot of homes are rising in price, and a lot of businesses are saying they have challenges with keeping people in the community to work. So they have to commute from quite a bit of a distance, and that is something that there should be some sort of middle range housing options as well. And one of the things that was discussed with Ida is this idea of cottage courts. This is just something as you can see from the picture. If you would remember or recall, there's a housing court behind the shopping, one of the, I think behind
You're talking about the mobile park? No,
yes,
IGA.
yes, behind IG, thank you. That is something that, this will be a more optimal alternative to having that sort of housing in the community. And this might be of the scale that would provide housing for middle income folks, especially those who would want to work in the community.
Hey, Kim, is that, are these cottage courts regularly used on septic systems?
Have they do what?
Are they regularly put up on septic systems?
Yes, they do put up on septic systems, and this is something that you could also make sure that in terms of the footprint of the plot to the number of units on it, that you make some provisions for that. So this doesn't simply mean that the density is high in terms of a lot. It more means that there are sizable units for a certain income level, and that they also provide a way for you to give cluster development an alternative to just basically single family residential R1 properties. But yes, depending on the lot, clearly one could have septic systems on these sort of developments, because as you can see, the orientation is to have all the entrances within the interior of the court, whereby the exterior and the rear ends of these structures can also fit septic systems or whatever else, more green space, rather than have one house taking up a bit of land and all you then have is I would say a waste of
And we have, and for something like this, these are usually rental properties, like.
No, they could be for owner occupied.
So we have to have a zoning and ordinance rules that allow the splitting of property and that stuff to support this.
Yes, to support this. Yeah. It's more like a higher density without it being, let's say, an apartment. Yeah. So these are basically a group of small 1 to 1.5 story detached structures arranged around a shared court and visible from the street. And units entrances should be from the shared court, as I mentioned earlier. So there should be some terms and definitions to have some specificity to what constitutes lodging and accommodation types. Should whole residential units and of a certain size be used for short-term rentals require, for example, that going back to short-term rentals, maybe you could also talk about how maybe a certain size of a short-term rental, given that it to some extent functions as a hotel because you have regular stream of guests coming through. Would you want to consider, let's say, having a sprinkler system in mind for those sort of properties? Because when you think that there's some revelry and whatever else, that is something that maybe we should get Will to think about or consider to see if it's a viable option for some of these properties, especially the ones that are more sizable than usual.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
How do you keep that, if you built something like that, how do you keep it from being just strictly rental property, in and out rental? What can you do to keep someone coming in here and building a bunch of those and have rental property?
Well, you can't regulate what property becomes rental or not, because the owner can decide to sell it or to rent it. So the idea that there is a way to arrest the number of rental units, the one way in which you would clearly know, or hopefully clearly know, that a property is for rent is if somebody comes up with an apartment complex, right? But if it's something of this nature, I don't see how you can regulate that it cannot be rented. There's no tool you can use to arrest that. This is more so to cater to a certain income level, a certain sort of housing option for middle housing, for people want to move into the community and don't want to have an R1 property, given the prices, for example, and that workers who might want to live and work and maybe even purchase properties in the area as well.
Is there an incentive method here? I mean, there's one, we've talked about regulation and incentive in this group a couple times. So is there an incentive to make it where it's a single-family dwelling or whatever, that's more of a long-term use?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the things that communities, well, companies, people who employ people could do is they could think of ways to be part or in the forefront of developing these sort of developments, and then figure out ways that if they are long-term employees, they might be incentivized to work and live in the community rather than see the jobs that they have in the community as being transient. So I would say that there are those sort of incentives if you have businesses in on the forefront of it in terms of working to provide housing for their staff. And then also if you could think of ways that these particular properties could have some sort of, I would say, some tax breaks in terms of people who want to purchase them, provided they can show that they have residency. They tend to have, they tend to live in it, but if somebody buys one and decides to move on somewhere else and rent it, there's nothing that one can do to arrest that.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Okay, exactly what you're talking about. The city of Nashville and the city of Maryland get a little bit closer to home. You mentioned the fact that housing prices are going way up. The reason they're going way up, the houses themselves, they're not homes anymore. They're businesses, which rob hotel, restaurants. You know how hard a restaurant has trouble staying open in this town. We've owned our home here 20 years and we live in a residential zone property. And we've got a business right next door to us. And we're going to have another business right next door to us. Not a home, not a residence, a business. Back to Maryville and Nashville. The way they got around this, in their zoning, if you want to have your house be a vacation rental by owner, the house has to have a full-time resident. Now that's in the Maryville zoning code. And I mean, what you're talking about, investment companies come in here and pay a big price because they know nobody's going to live there. All they're going to do is charge, $500-600 a night plus.
Yeah, so that is why.
And anyway, I got into this maybe 3 years ago, and one of the guys that regulated the property uses and management, et cetera, he says, yeah, but they're charging $800 a night, and they have 7 or 8 cars out there in front. I can only find them $50. So I'm not saying I ought to say we, because like I said, I've had property here 20 years, and I'm in town just about every week.
All right.
And just to add like Maryland, you have to have a full-time resident. And then you can rent it, but you got to have a full-time resident.
Yeah, so Kim, I'm interested in this suggestion. Let's explore it for just a minute. We can take a note and we can certainly find the relevant section of the zoning code for Maryville. But in this situation, would that be dictated by a zone? Would it be sort of a R2E? Or how would you enforce that? I appreciate incentives, but we don't have a property tax to start with, so nobody's going to get a break on their property tax. But I'm thinking about in terms of zoning, would you encourage something like this through zoning?
ADUs, accessory dwelling units, this could be another form but this would require its own sub-zone of some sort. And in terms of the way to make sure that this is a full-time resident, as I mentioned earlier, you could require that every owner should have a driver's license or something that establishes that they are living and or working in the community or in the larger area. Okay. As a matter of process, if I could please get through all the slides,
Yeah,
and then we have the comments after that.
okay.
And everybody has a note-taking device to take notes on the PowerPoint. And then after I finish the presentation, then if you could then come forward, and then given your notes, you can come up to the mic and, and then tender those comments, the feedback. Okay, so if you move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned also, another thing is the idea of the accessory dwelling units. And ADUs, as they are typically called, are basically the opportunity to convert portions of existing homes, to make additions, to make standalone structures, and also their potential for increasing housing affordability. The red areas on those greenhouses show you the different types of ADUs that can be encouraged or can be realized in a residential community, or let's say in a residential unit in its lot. Okay, so we will want to at some point figure out what is the community-wide consensus on ADUs, and should Townsend allow for only pre-existing detached units, or allow for proportional size attachments per the parent principal spaces dimensions, or other ways in which the city should consider them. The Eastern EC Realtors strongly suggest that there are viable way to also create more affordable housing. It also provides for income for homeowners, and by extension, typically this type of units would require or imply that a full-time owner would have to be, a full-time resident would have to be in the building. Next slide, please. Sorry. And then when it comes to terms as well, as you can see, there's some restrictions. There is this amusement arcades, for example. Townsend has in its ordinance the allowance for amusements and arcades. It's something that we think is in keeping with the peaceful ethos and the landscape beauty of and the low impact development typical of Townsend. And so therefore, is it something that you want to consider dispensing with in your ordinance? And if they're still to be permissible, how may Townsend have them contained, clearly defined, and perhaps allowed only as enclosed spaces, units, or structures? Okay, so that's one thing that I think the city should think through in terms of arcades and amusement parks. Then also, there is this mention about arterial streets, and this is something that I think has some relevance to most cities needing a major road plan, which helps define subdivision regulations and review. So this is something that also I think the city should begin to address again. The last one that was done for Townsend was done in 2008. So I would say that when you do the corridor study, it's something that you should include in that. Because if you do one now, and you have some plans for the corridor, amongst other things, let's say dealing with the partnership and the roads behind the partnership, those might change the classification of the roads. So I think you should incorporate the major road plan in the corridor study. Next slide, please. And this one has to do with automobile wrecking. I think this is another thing that also needs to be made clearer. Are we talking about towing services? Are we talking about junkyards, salvage yards, mechanics yards? So you should also consider what it means for that sort of wrecking facility. It is something that will exist solely in transit, awaiting insurance processing and further shipping onto a wreck yard where total vehicles are repaired or junked or stored. So I think this is something that also the city should think through, because this term risks you having a sort of nuisance, a blight in your community, which would be completely that this is not what Townsend should be all about. Then also with the bed and breakfast and tourism homes, again, what a short-term facility should be in terms of a lobby, parking space, a singular building or collection of permanent structures, a restaurant, R1 or R2 for short-term, a gazebo. The emphasis on any sort of hospitality, I say, should rest on the nuisances, the safety, the ability to capture revenue, and also registry. And like I mentioned before, one of the ways to make registry an issue is for people to have established residency here before they get to operate one of these things. Or you can also limit the number of the various types of investment versus full-time rental and full-time occupancy, or having a rental agent that stays on the property, what have you. So therefore, the specificity should hone in on these sort of determinations. Do we want to simply limit short-term unoccupied residential rentals to preserve our community? Or then how do we allow them, yet still, for those who have the right to have short-term rentals in their primary residences? So at the same time, once I mentioned before, is how would you want to capture revenue for these sort of things, ensure safety, and also to make sure that you abate any potential nuisances. Next slide. And again, with terms, some of these terms also is something that should be looked into some more. And with billboards, I know that billboards are banned, and you also should also look to them to make sure that they protect any view sheds. And they are, as I mentioned, they're already banned in 8308.3. And one should also, we suggest that the city do a sign inventory to assist it with the further monitoring and administration of these sign regulations. Because right now, I don't think the city knows where all these signs are, how to keep track of them. Another thing also to keep in mind is that you should come up with a formula for when such a structure gets destroyed, let's say by a storm. What constitutes that it cannot be put back up as was, given that you don't allow for, there should be some sort of formula, something more concrete in terms of when such an issue should come up. So I think another thing that you should think about in terms of your ordinance, which is, I think, is a potentially very troubling thing, is that somewhere in the ordinance it doesn't allow for mobile homes, and that language also needs to be changed. And as I mentioned in the past, one way is to make sure that there's clear construction building standards for homes that are mobile but have a permanent footprint, so they can't just be rooted up and moved on. And the state law says that they should be allowed, they cannot be banned. Okay, next slide, please. And then also with building height as well, you have a height of 3 stories. The question is, will you also entertain the idea of subterranean floors and where, if you are interested in allowing for that there be a variance that justifies that, let's say somebody can only go 2 floors, but they would like to have a 3-floor story limit. If they were able to put it subterraneanly underground, should that be allowed to be a variance? And because there's no in the ordinance that says that they are expressly allowed, a routine normal basement is, but nothing that is a full occupied subterranean floor to a structure. And then of course you have to consider things like whether there's sinkholes in the area, so you then be requiring some sort of architectural, engineering, or surveying certification, but that is not an issue. So I think that's another thing that the city should also think about. Next slide. Next one here, we have things dealing with beverages and
Campgrounds.
yes, sorry, yeah, I'm sorry. So then another thing is also camping areas were amended in 2023. And these amendment language needs some confirmation. Ordinance 131-031C exists, not in the zoning ordinance, but in the municipal code. That was a question that was asked about that particular ordinance. And presumably, one party may involve a family unit camping out in their own backyard. That is why perhaps it says for 2 or more instead of just one. And so, for example, at the March 2025 PC Planning Commission meeting, 8025 on all highways 73, there was a business license request for a bed and breakfast, whose facilities include a bar and kitchen infrastructure. Which then, what would this be then considered as in terms of its beverage and food sales? And then a grocery store choosing to sell or rent equipment. That question was also asked, whether those should be allowed. And there was a question also about the square footage that has been mentioned, 3,000 square feet. The average convenience store measures at 3,230 square feet. However, in most rural areas, it tends to run around 4,900, so let's say 5,000. And for urban locales, it runs about 4,500. Then also, newer store space requirements requiring more than average square footage, they would typically be needed because if, let's say, that particular establishment wanted to have touch screens, kiosks, and open kitchen design or seating areas. So that is something that also the city should think about in terms of the size requirements for convenience stores. So the campground issue, to go back to that, to make sure I'm clearly expressing myself in that regard, it's saying that campgrounds are for 2 or more, and again, there I would assume that the implication is that for 1, it implies a single family property. You have family members camping out, let's say kids are camping out overnight, so that shouldn't constitute as a campground because it's just an informal, familial use of the property for recreational camping, family specific. Then also there was an issue in here about there's some dormitories also mentioned in the that you might want to consider because it was approved for Yonder, for example, and there's been this consistent need to have employee housing. It's come up again and again across a lot of tourism-centered local communities. And again, the mention of manufactured modular homes is something that you should consider for the peer construction in replacement of not banning mobile homes in the community.
I don't know what you're saying. Are you saying that we cannot have manufactured homes on a piece of property? I don't know what you were saying.
Okay. You cannot ban any manufactured modular structures in Tennessee. What you can do is to make sure that the construction of them meet permanency more so than being temporary. So you can have a mobile home park where you put them in a particular district, but you cannot ban a manufactured home in a residential community. You have to use construction signs to make sure that it is able to be built in a residential community. So one community that I mentioned has done this in the past is Danbury.
Is what?
Is Danbury. Danbury has a peer construction ordinance. I've also presented one to the community, to the planning commission before. I would suggest that we look at it carefully and maybe see how we can have that effectively in Townsend. Then, so again, the issue comes up again with ADUs. ADU seems to be something that is being strongly recommended, as I mentioned, even with the real estate community. And in Plainview, in Pittman Center, and Knoxville, these are all places that allow it. And it gives an option for residents to have family stays and also to rent them out. Again, that would also then, on the back end, ensure that residential homes are more used for residential purposes rather than for investment purposes. It has that added effect. Next slide. Again, the issue about junkyards and salvage yards, what should be allowable? I say that any junkyards or salvage yards should be discouraged in the community. Townsend has an industrial zone. It just clearly has a generic industrial zone. I would say that that labeling or that intensity of use should be at a light industrial scale, because if anything comes in that is industrial and you don't have any sort of high
Are we a slide behind?
Yeah.
I think we're a slide behind.
Yeah.
One more slide.
Junkyard.
There you go,
Okay.
salvage yard. Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, I'm sorry, excuse me for that. So that's something that I think that the city should make sure that they revisit. And so it should also, when it comes to the planned unit developments, I think the verbiage needs to be a little bit more specific for multi-uses. And there should be some talk about unifying design standards so that when these things are developed, there's some aesthetic considerations put into it. So let's say it should allow for mixed uses. It should encourage unifying design principles and also aesthetic uniformity. It should have a common development intent. Let's say a conservation subdivision. It should have some sort of pedestrian emphasis. It could also be a reasonable public access amenities like walking trails. So it shouldn't be more so like they are cloistered places that are cut off from the public realm. Rather, they should be encouraged to be open-ended enough that it doesn't corner off parts of the community and doesn't allow for full participation from the public realm. So you could have things like shared easements of ownership or a single easement area lease. And then, next slide please, I'm sorry. And we have this thing about recreational vehicles. It mentions that these things should be temporary and it should be consistent with short-term living quantities of days, 30 days or less. And that is something that the city should also look at and also make a qualification of, because what about luxury camper buses which do not require towing? Are those then to be removed or further qualified in this particular zoning ordinance? And then the question again is that what actually constitutes as, how long is temporary for those sort of structures, or those sort of vehicles? And then with the shopping center, can it be required that all shopping centers should have design standards as well as a PUD would. So if when you have the shopping centers, you also have some stricter design and aesthetic guidelines so that it is more of an aesthetic pleasing unified development to the area. And then also, we suggest that the language on special events should be changed for up to 1 day. The language in there indicates that it just needs a little more qualification about what those special events constitute in terms of duration, because they can go up to 2 weeks. And then also, I mentioned before the thing about the subterranean floors. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and then continuance of non-conforming uses. Is this, somebody asked if it is typical, and it says, yes, it is typical, as it also covers all billboards and signs. So regarding any non-conforming building which has been damaged by fire or other causes, it's typical, it's something that, as I mentioned earlier, sorry, with the damage of continuous of non-conforming uses, there should be detailed methodology for making these determinations, as I mentioned earlier. Like, let's say an assessed value exercise of some sort should be done, maybe by the building inspector or who have you, to make sure that it is for this reason and this specific determination, quantifiable or not, and that we then decide that this is no longer to be allowed as a continuation of the non-conforming use. And then we also want to think about ways in which to abolish parking minimums. Typically, parking minimums rather increase impervious surfaces. So there must be a business incentive within businesses that they would find the optimal amount of parking for their establishments, whether they be shared or not. So the ordinance should think of ways to have different establishments share parking, rather than saying that because of this size of facility, you must have this number of spaces, which then invariably increases impervious surface, and in some cases, you find a lot of shopping centers with a lot of empty parking lots and parking spaces, which could be then recovered back to green cover if you don't have these strict, parking minimums. I think that's something that the city should look at. Next slide, please. So then also with off-street parking, we think that there's a way to sort of come up with a matrix that may specify optimal number of spaces rather than a prescribed number of them, irrespective of the actuality of the observed trends. So from land use, you make progressions to square footage, to parking ratios, and a ration that will then derive a recommended number of parking spaces rather than a required number of parking spaces.
Question, does that say that you're suggesting Townsend needs a parking garage?
No, I'm saying that that is one option to also mitigate impervious surfaces.
How can we stop from having a parking garage in Townsend? We are not Pigeon Forge or Gatlinburg. We don't need a parking garage in Townsend, so how can we prevent that from happening?
Well, like I just mentioned, one of the ways is to not have parking minimums.
Why? What maybe
Yeah.
we want to make sure they can't have too many.
Well, let me just address parking for a moment, and then we need to continue so we can get through the slides. Now, Kim, we have to stop no later than 6:50. But, yeah, so we want you to get through the slides so that we can then provide comment. We'll probably end up providing comment after the workshop. With respect to parking, I believe we do need a parking plan, okay? Because one of the things that we have issues with is overflow parking and people parking all over the right-of-way and other things in our green space. So I do believe we need a parking plan. If you look at parking garages, it's not always the case that parking garages have to go up. So if you look at some communities, they actually have subterranean parking garages in order to preserve green space on top. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, but I do think that we do have to give some thought to having our parking better organized so that we preserve our green spaces and pedestrian ways. Okay, Ken, let's continue on.
Yes, sure. So anyway, I think you said it more eloquently than I could ever have, so let's leave that at that and move on to the next things. So we can get through the stuff. So basically, like I mentioned before, like you mentioned, is to come up with a land use and parking matrix to make sure that parking is optimal rather than just strictly and reflectively, let's say reflexively required. It should be rather, recommended per ration that meets everybody's needs. Then I mentioned also before the corridor management plan. I think that corridor management plan should intend to restrict road and especially driveway access onto 321, such as doesn't end up like Pigeon Forge, Kingston Pike, or whatever else. And then also to make sure that driveway widths covered in 8305.5 between these and the T.dot minor as well be put into the ordinance as well as be addressed in the corridor management plan. So somebody made the suggestion that a lot of the other requirements that are required by the state, for example, should also be considered to be put in the ordinance, especially the checklist. Next slide. And then again with plan unit developments, we think that there's another way to also think about how we can have a PUD overlay designation. And this would be a preventive means and method to prevent green cover, to sort of preserve green cover, arrest impervious surface, protect vistas, and double up on citywide aesthetic standards. I think the PUD, and especially if it's an overlay, let's say of a particular size, it's a very good way to negotiate with a developer. Because here, nothing is done by right, everything is done by a meeting of minds to come up with what the developer or the investor should expect as against what the community also would prefer. And also, there's also language that we should strengthen that a PD's determination, as I mentioned just now, is that it shouldn't be just per the judgment of the municipality and not also per the judgment of the municipality and not just the sole choice of the developer. Next slide, please. In this one, PDs also should be more integrative, more so than exclusionary. I mentioned also the thing about the public realm. I mentioned already about the things about the road plan. And this is something that towns needs to consider developing since the last did in 2008. So, next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of what the current and years-long road plan is. As I mentioned, it should be covered into the corridor management study. And it consists of basically coming up with classifications for all roads. And as I mentioned earlier, if the corridor management study should instrument the change in any of these designations, the two things should coexist at the same time towards their development. And as you can see right now, 321 is described as a material, also Old Highway 72 from Depot to West Valley. Chestnut Road is a collector, Black Marsh Hollow and Bethel Streets are local roads, minor streets, surface streets. So that exercise should, I think, be something that the zoning ordinance should think through. And then also have some transitional zoning and overlay schema given the classifications of those roads. Let's say the roads surrounding the blood partnership, for example. Next slide, please. Sign regulations. Does town want to revisit its sign sizes? A strong approach will be to incorporate sign regulations into a design review process. Cambridge, for example, has a design review board that they meet regularly every single month, and everything that is proposed for development, if it has any design implications, they have to come before the city to have those things discussed. So at minimum, I think the city should think of it being an addendum to the zoning ordinance. Okay? And again, my colleagues mentioned that Pittman Center is a place that some of these things can be learned from. Next slide. For the site plan review process, I would say that improved buffering and screening by a design review board could also be something that could be done. So again, I think a design review board should be thought of or be developed for the city. There is a loophole, as one of the commentators mentioned, is that if you do bit by bit, you could end up with a building that has been allowed to have some small improvements could end up being a big set of improvements. So one of the suggestions here is to make sure that the language says that any addition should be from the original footprint, not that because it's an addition, now that's the footprint, and then you can keep adding on to a larger and larger size, but each addition should be rooted back to the original footprint of the building. Okay. And then again, all these building standards should ultimately be consistent with the visions, land use policies, and other design criteria that we have said you should strongly consider. So also, with residential plot plan, requirements should be to revisit content requirements, shape and dimensions, tax map and parcel numbers, setbacks and easement, as well as shape, size and location of buildings. And this should also be something that is salient for ADUs, for example, in terms of additions, for example. And again, overlays will have their checklist items as well, and be considered and adhered to, as would, let's say, driving permitting also be added to the checklist. Next slide, please. So here, there are some comments in blue that need some clarification for the person who tendered them. It mentions some things dealing with the checklist, but the way the person made those comments, they added it to the end of the checklist rather than address item by item what they are. So there's some confusion what exactly those particular things, like remove or limit the language. We don't know which of them specifically that those comments are being made in reference to. If you go to the next slide, the one that says setbacks and buffer. Yeah, there you go. For this one, as you can see, it says that for a guest user, the commentator suggests that increased, and also that the foliage or the vegetation should be used instead of native. You should also maybe include evergreens as well. I don't know what that implications that might have for the landscape, but that is something that somebody else suggested. So the foliage or the green cover, and then also something with screening and fencing could also be something that could be considered when it comes to minimum yard requirements, and this could be something that also could be rolled into the design review process. Next slide, please. Then we suggest that the standards for lighting are very strong. We also want to suggest that you can compare and contrast yours against those of Alcoa, because Alcoa has a very good, innovative way to maintain dark skies over the newly created and grown downtown area that is adjacent to the airport, which I've mentioned to you quite a number of times in the past. Next slide, please. So one of the inquiries will be for should towns allow ADUs in residential districts. I mentioned all those particular things in the past. But then also, if ADUs are accepted or considered, what about the capacities of septic systems? How will they need to be vetted to confirm that existing septic allowances will cater or accommodate increased occupancies of any residential properties, if they're allowed. Okay, next slide. Here, we suggest for any annexations, most of the times we have issues where when things are annexed or things are done, they are just basically, they are tantamount to just being paperwork exercises. So if there's any annexation to be had in Townsend, and I would assume that Townsend at some point will want to annex across the river, that there should be some diligent annexation studies done, not just to say we want to take the land and we want to annex it, but we should have a full-fledged study of what that implies for the city in terms of services, in terms of types of development, or what have you. So that is something that I think should be kept in mind as well. And then, when it comes to vehicles and temporary mobile, factory-built and factory-assembled structures, and these, as I mentioned before, have to rest on structural considerations. And also, the question then should also be asked about what constitutes as temporary. So, except for this, as the law says, it shall be unlawful to occupy, allowed to be occupied, store or place, or allowed to be stored or placed any temporary mobile, factory-built or factory-assembled structure, which is not in keeping with the intent of the law that currently exists in Tennessee. Next slide, please. And then with storm water requirements, I think there should be permits and inspection from the state, and add that to the checklist as well as something that should be. So besides the TDEP erosion control and sediment and the sediment control manual, there should be other ones that should be added for best practices purposes, as I've mentioned, for in terms of their the annexation, sorry. So, for example, I'm currently studying the Highway System Access Manual Corridor Management Agreement Guidance in preparation for the corridor study. And then somebody also asked about whether things should be more than 10 feet, and should lot sizes and configurations be privileged for variance in that regard when it comes to buffers, or should it simply rise it then 10 feet for that particular requirement for buffer requirements. Next slide. So on this one as well, I think one of the things that the city could consider is looking through for PUDs and transition zones. PUDs to cover things such as tourism, cluster housing such as cottage courts, and also larger developments to that end. And there should also be some bordering, and with transitional zones is something that the city should consider to make sure that the growth-prone areas of the community don't provide nuisances, or the residential areas are protected from these sort of uses. For example, the land partnership, so that the people who live adjacent to it, you don't have people parking on the roads, creating congestion in a residential community. So there should be some sort of transitional zone that within this, the transition from this zone to this zone, or from this intensity of use to that intensity of use, there should be some regulations put in place to mitigate it against impinging on the residential communities. Next slide, please. And somebody made a mention about replace with newer versions. I'm not sure what that person specifically means by newer versions. Are they saying that people should replace their dilapidated mobile homes? I'm not sure what that means. And something of that nature could be actually addressed through design standards. Aesthetics is one of the most flexible ways in which you can regulate. You can have regulations that allow for keeping your community pleasant looking, protecting visitors among other things. So, again, regarding such dimensions for hotels, which invite anything that basically invites nomenclature disagreements, is something that should be, steered away from in that regard. Let's think of hospitality, and as I mentioned, I gave about 13 different variations of what lodging and accommodation establishment could be. Okay, next slide. That also just talks about nomenclative definitions. We'll just continue on beyond that. But here is where we want to talk about is accessory building provisions for businesses. Should that be any different from for residences? And what should that be for especially B1 tourism districts, as already B3, which is not in place yet or will never be in place, whatever the case may be, also allows for accessory buildings provided that they are located in the rear and no closer than 5 feet to any other property line. Next slide. And then so this needs to be clarified in terms of what is permitted in B2. Is this a mixed-use commercial residential development where the property owner may live on the premises? And is a bed and breakfast a separate use, or is it that a bed and breakfast is something where you consider that an owner, an employee also lives on premises? So these are some of the things. And then the question about what is the significance of that particular size or square footage for 8605-1B. It's another thing that the city should look into. And then there was an issue here about in the highway business district P3, that only group house were mentioned as a permitted use. And the question is, why only wineries for that special exception and not others? The idea is that all alcohol is alcohol, all alcohol is intoxicating, all alcohol can have relatively a shorter span of nuisances or safety concerns. So the development is about where it's only wineries that are allowed for exception. And then mentioned before on the next slide, please, about subterranean floors and whether these are subject to geotechnical study determinations and certifications is something that I already mentioned in the past. Next slide. Somebody makes the question which the planning commission should make the determination about when will these hearings happen in terms of amendment notices. And then also for other notes, there's a few things that need to be looked at in terms of fonts and formatting, and that is something that we could work through as an administrative issue, and then brought before in terms of putting it on record that there were some changes made to the format, not necessarily the content. Okay. So that's my presentation. I would like to ask that we come up to the mic and give you have your notes, and then come up to the mic and say what those are so we can capture specifically how your comments and your feedback or your questions relate to the slides.
Kelsey, can you get those lights, please? Kelsey?
We only have about 10 minutes left
Okay.
total. We have to be finished at about 10 till so we can get prepared for our city council meeting tonight. Would it be acceptable for people to provide their comments after the meeting? Because aren't there a couple more things you wanted to go over, zoning overlays and?
No, this is it for now for this.
This is it for now?
Yes. We will,
The one thing that is going to happen after this workshop is that we're going to come up with a questionnaire, a survey,
Okay.
to get decision points from the public. Do they want to allow ADUs? What are some of the things they want to see be realized in the zoning ordinance? And just like with the feedback from these people on public record, all those responses in a structured format, will then also be handed over to the city for record keeping, so that when any decision making is done, we know what was provided in terms of input and what the preferences are in terms of what the community wants at large. So that there's no room for fake memories or reinterpretations or
Okay. Would it be, so we can take 10 minutes and let folks provide comments, but can we accept comments after this?
yes, so on the forms that you have, if you want to write legibly and hand over to Gayla, I can pick out from Gayla in the next few days as well,
Okay.
and then I'll have those comments.
Okay, so let's say within 1 week is
1 week, yes.
Okay, so if anybody has comments that they want to provide that they're not able to
Right
provide,
now,
they can provide them to City Hall,
pair those forms.
yeah,
that I can-
in any format, and we'll collate those and get them over. Okay.
I have a request. You see these little boxes here?
Yes,
Can't read any of it. 65, what, over 50% of the community is over 65?
I agree with you
I
there.
would like to have what you had up there, which are these little boxes, printed on a full page. I don't need writing space. I need, so I can read what it is. So may I get a copy of full page copies?
Yes, I can get you a copy like this.
Let me see.
This one is a slide on each page.
Can you make the print any bigger?
But we'll do our best, Mary Kate, and make it available in a.
I'll send a copy of this slide, of the slides where one slide is on the page to Gayla, and you can request a copy of that from him.
Yeah, anybody that would like to request that can do so. Okay, so let's use the balance of our time, 8 more minutes for anyone that would like to provide any public comments, and then we'll accept additional comments up to 1 week.
I'll just say something.
Come to the microphone.
Hi, I'm Tommy Normally. I wanted to, I don't know, advocate, but I really like the idea, because I have one, of owner-occupied ADUs or whatever, because it makes you accountable to your neighbors. My neighbors know if anything's going on, they need to call me. We've never had any problems, but I feel a great responsibility to my neighborhood to make sure that I am there if anything goes on. So I just want to say, I think it's a really good use of the ADU units if the owner is there, and it encourages people to be involved in the community.
Thank you. You can, also, I requested we find a similar ordinance that was mentioned in there. Yeah,
I
okay.
looked that up real quick, I looked that up and it said that they didn't have that, but you cannot have short-term rentals in residential areas.
Okay. Well,
Christina, you can or you cannot.
I asked that exact question to ChatGPT and said no.
So
But
you can.
you don't have to have them on owner occupied,
Oh,
but they can be in residential areas. That's what I read
Okay.
real quickly.
We'll get the information.
Yes, you can't disallow it. The question is that, what can you put in place to make sure they're not just empty, seasonal, or investor properties? Residential requirements, that sort of thing, ADUs in pre-existing homes. That is a good way to have that medium.
Maybe the ADUs.
We'll look at it.
Jeff Riddle, 134 Myers Road. Slide 35, Kim. Is this where you say you suggest adding residents back to B1 that addresses the question that I have? I think I'm just sort of clarifying if that's what that is. That you add residents back to B1?
Well, that is something that is in flux with the city. They haven't decided whether they're going to enact and actually geolocate districts for B3 or B2. So until that conversation is had and that decision is made, it's something that basically...
But that's, I just wanted to be sure that was
This
in
is,
there.
yeah, this is a broader discussion. Right now, we have, I think, 7 zoning districts, and so for the land use and transportation plan, we might contemplate that we need additional types of zoning districts. But Jeff, what you're asking about is, in the short term, we're actually looking to see if we can put residences back into B1.
Okay.
So we're working on that at the city council level, planning commission.
Any more comments? All right, all hearts and minds clear. I'd like to adjourn this meeting so we can get on with our regular commission meeting. Vote, are you, your hearts and mind clear? Okay, very good.
Yeah,
All right.
I would just say sincere thanks. I saw all the comments from the ETDD crew that are represented in the slide deck, so that I know that represents a very close look, and I'm grateful for the work of ETDD.
Sure, thank you.
That was obviously a lot of work.
Make a motion to adjourn the
It was,
meeting.
yeah.
A motion to adjourn the meeting.
Motion, second,
Second.
meeting adjourned. All in favor?
Aye.